Okay, so in the first section, which was much more me talking to you, we were looking at the context and some of the contemporary responses to the appeal. In this second section, I want to pick up some of the practical aspects of the appeal, but then I'm going to talk a bit about the influence more generally, and then I want you to think about, can the appeal still speak to us now, and what is our ecumenical vision now? So in the first section, I was really looking at the vision that the bishops at Lambeth were offering. They did, however, not just offer a big vision, but also some practical, some practical recommendations. One of the first recommendations was the conference recommends to the authorities of the Church of the Anglican Communion that they should formally invite the authorities of other churches to confer with them concerning the possibility of taking definite steps to cooperate in common endeavour on the lines set forth in the appeal. So right from the beginning, the appeal was thought of as something that would happen locally or regionally or provincially, as the Anglicans quite often talk about it. And that was reiterated by Resolution 11. So the appeal itself is Resolution 9, and then 10 and 11. The task of effecting union with other Christian communions must be undertaken by national, regional or provincial authorities of the churches. It's not an attempt to set up some kind of global unity. It's an attempt to say, actually, each church needs to be working with churches local to it. And then, what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. So we've seen that Kikuyu in 1913, the Bishop of Zanzibar had got very upset about the mission societies coming together for a Eucharist with an Anglican president at which everybody received. So what was going to be allowed? And we can see from the discussions that were going on in the committees of the conference, that there were different views about this. In fact, you saw that as leading up to the appeal, that there were different views in the English context about whether or not pulpit exchange and what we would now call mutual Eucharistic hospitality, which is what they mean when they talk intercommunion, whether or not that should be allowed. Trying not to cough into the microphone. And this is the point at which Maclean felt that the appeal was speaking with two voices, the point that you were picking up earlier, Marcus. In view of prospects and projects of reunion, a bishop is justified in giving occasional authorization to ministers not episcopally ordained, who, in his judgment, are working towards an ideal of union, such as described in our appeal, to preach in churches within his diocese, and to clergy of a diocese to preach in the churches of such ministers. Now, one of the things I think this text reminds us is just how far we've come. In 1926, George Bell, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury's chaplain, was appointed Dean of Canterbury. And George Bell was a very committed ecumenist, and he decided to invite the president of the Federal Council of Evangelical Free Churches in England to preach in Canterbury Cathedral. He wrote to every single clergy person in the diocese to explain what he was doing. There were letters in the newspapers. He got permission from the Archbishop of Canterbury simply to invite somebody else to preach in the church. We've come a long way since 1920 or 1926. And I think sometimes we're now so familiar with some of the things that can happen almost as a matter of course that we forget just how far we've come. So this was a huge step, the idea of inviting somebody who was not ordained in your church to preach in your church was in the 1920s an almost unthinkable thing to do. And as I said, there's this newspaper cuttings book at Lambeth Palace, A first whole lot of newspaper cuttings around the appeal and the responses to the repeal, and then there's a whole lot more in 1925 around this invitation to for and I've forgotten his name, which is really embarrassing, but for the President of the Free Church Council to preach in Canterbury Cathedral. The bishops of the Anglican Communion will not question the action of any bishops who, in the few years between initiation and completion of a definite scheme of union, shall countenance the irregularity, and this is the word that Norman MacLean really objected to, of admitting to communion the baptised but unconfirmed communicants of non-episcopal church congregations concerned in the scheme. Now, again, just a reminder that communion tables were much more strongly policed back in the 1920s, at least in theory, than they are now. I think that's probably a fair... I can hear some laughter, but I think it's a fair... I think it was much harder for people to receive communion. Again, George Bell, in the 1950s, had an ecumenical delegation. By that time, he was Bishop of Chichester, to Chichester, and they decided they were going to have a morning Eucharist. This was 1954, I think. There was a huge scandal about it because he invited everybody to receive. Again, I think just a reminder of just how far we have moved, that the principles that some of the YMCA and the chaplains were arguing for, that if people were doing something together, if they were at an ecumenical conference, if they were on retreat together, that you would invite everybody to receive communion together, that is much less scandalous now than it was, if it's scandalous at all. And I won't ask about people's personal practices, but I would think many of us would not think twice about receiving communion in a church to which we don't belong, and nobody would actually particularly ask us. And there's all sorts of questions around that, around the relationship between Eucharist and baptism, for instance. And I'm also aware that I'm making assumptions here about the sacramental nature of churches, and there were several people who were not members of sacramental churches, and there were different questions around there about involvement and mutual invitations. But the Eucharist was a place which excluded people in the 1920s. And it is really intriguing that at the Lambeth Conference in 1930, there was a massive Eucharist for the conference with lots of people invited in Westminster Abbey or in St Paul's Cathedral, one or the other, and thousands of people there, and the only people who received were the bishops. So there's real shifts in practice around the Eucharist as well in this period. So, but this language irregularity, as we've already seen, Norman MacLean, I've always deemed it a privilege to receive the Holy Communion. I feel it keenly that I shall never again be able to have that privilege, because I would not come to the table under the condition of irregularity as now defined. So, this is one of the reasons why Norman MacLean felt that the appeal was speaking with two voices. This openness in Resolution 9 to say we want to move forward, and then what he felt a real closing down of practice in Resolution 12 to restrict access. And I think this is one of the tensions that we often experience in the ecumenical movement between our real sense of unity and then where does church law leave us? And how do our instincts towards unity get caught up with the expectations of our individual churches and their laws? And that I think is an ongoing question. It's certainly an ongoing question which I, as somebody who's very involved in ecumenical theology, grapple with continually. So, and here the extension of Resolution 12, believing that certain lines of action might imperil the attainment of its ideal and the unity of its own communion, the conference declares that it cannot approve of general schemes of intercommunion or exchange of pulpits, and it cannot approve the celebration in Anglican churches of the Holy Communion for members of the Anglican Church by ministers who have not been episcopally ordained. And this continues for those of you who've had experience of working with Anglicans and building up local ecumenical projects and so on. B2 actually continues to be something with which Anglican ecumenists have to grapple. It's solidly rooted in most canon law of most Anglican churches. And I was going to say something else about that, but I think I've got a slide coming back to it in a minute. But one of the questions here, and I think this is a question which the Roman Catholic Church answers differently from other churches on the ecumenical journey, with the possible exception of the Orthodox, is the point at which intercommunion, sharing communion, can happen. Most churches have found themselves in a situation in which we will invite people, or certainly Anglicans have found themselves in a situation, perhaps I shouldn't assume, but I don't think we're the only ones, in which mutual Eucharistic hospitality, inviting people to receive at each other's tables, can happen before mutual recognition of ministries has happened. That's not true of the Roman Catholic Church. And I think what's going on there is a holding to the principles of the appeal to all Christian people and the recognition of the movement of the Spirit in each other's churches. One of the things, as we'll see in a minute, that the Archbishop of Canterbury was worried about is if you allow people to receive communion in each other's churches and to invite each other to preach, then is there actually any impetus for taking unity any further? And that's actually, I think, a really good question. And the evidence of the ecumenical movement might be that the answer is no. The appeal also made some recommendations which are of things that most of us actually will recognise as quite standard these days in our ecumenical practice. For instance, councils representing all Christian communions should be formed in areas as centres of united effort to promote the physical, moral and social welfare of the people. We might not talk about them in quite those terms anymore. I don't think we talk about the physical, moral and social welfare of the people anymore. But the idea that actually we want to have councils of churches working together to serve the people around us is something that we're very familiar with. And this is the foundation of things like councils of churches, action of churches together. Every branch of the Church of England should develop the constitutional government of the Church and make fuller use of the capacities of its members for service. The appeal gave quite an impetus to reflections in the Anglican context of the involvement of lay people. And one of the points in the appeal, and this is going back to the appeal itself, we greatly desired that the office of bishop should be exercised in a representative and constitutional manner. Some Anglican churches until 1920 had no synods. They had no lay representation in the governance of the church. And one of the things that Anglicans were taking on board with the appeal was actually the need to involve everybody in the governance of the church and to make it the potential involvement of lay people as well as the ordained. So this is a place I would submit, I hope, that actually the Anglican Church itself or Anglican churches have made a lot of progress in the last 100 years. And bishops are no longer known as Lord Bishop in quite the same way as they were in 1920. And it is extraordinary reading correspondence at that stage where the language of Lord Bishop of my grace is absolutely omnipresent. Now, all of this leads up to the discussion of actually how do you achieve unity? And in the Anglican context, often the sticking point is the question of ordination. What the appeal says about this is as follows. If the authorities of other communions so desire, bishops and clergy of our communion would willingly accept from these authorities a form of commission or recognition that would commend our ministry to their congregations. as having its place in the one family life. It's our hope that the same motive would lead ministers who have not received it to accept a commission through episcopal ordination, as obtaining for them a ministry throughout the whole fellowship. In acting so, no one of us could possibly be taken to repudiate his past ministry. God forbid that any man should repudiate a past experience rich in spiritual blessings for himself and others. Nor would any of us be dishonouring the Holy Spirit of God, whose call led us all to our several ministries and whose power enabled us to perform them. We shall be publicly and formally seeking additional recognition of a new call to wider service in a reunited church, and imploring for ourselves God's grace and strength to fulfil the same. This becomes the key point at which discussions with the free churches fail, and it's a point at which is also picked up very quickly in Scotland as being related to the question of, is this reordination? William Patterson, who was the moderator of General Assembly in 1922 of the Church of Scotland, asked at the Assembly when the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Peterborough and the Primus of the Scottish Episcopal Church were there, whether it was not possible to agree regarding the ceremony and a prayer of consecration and the grant of a commission from a wider section of the church as the vital things, without entering on any inquiry whether this was reordination or not. Can we not get away from the language of reordination, he said. Again, this is the appeal picking up an issue which continues to be the crux often in Anglican negotiations with other churches. And the question of deficit, are Anglicans saying that other churches do not have a deficient ministry? I think there was a real attempt in the appeal to say that is not the case. Ministries are rich in spiritual blessings. This is about actually seeing churches recognising ministers mutually. But as I say, it remains an issue, and it will no doubt resurface in the common calling discussions. So the bishop said, we do not ask that any communion should consent to be absorbed into another, but that all should unite into a new and great endeavour to recover and manifest to the world the unity of the body of Christ for which Christ prayed. That was their vision of different churches coming together. I've already said that one of the results of this was the Church of South India. We could add to that the Church of North India and the Church of Pakistan. We can't add to that the Church of Sri Lanka or the Church of Lanka, which we should be able to, because their negotiations stalled right at the last minute with a legal challenge over church property. And this is, I think, the issue. It reminds us that one of the issues of unity is not just about how we feel about each other and that we enjoy being together, but that once you start to say we want to unite as a church, or to take two churches and unite them into one church, isn't it the old chestnut that you take two churches and you make out of them three? Unity proceedings always end up with more churches than you started with. The Church of Scotland itself is a good example of this. In 1922, when the General Assemblies were replying to the appeal, they really did think that they were going to be able to get on with their reuniting and then a couple of years later get on with being able to talk about other things. But then it took until 1929 because of sorting out the legal difficulties. Church unity, and the Church of England has a particular problem here because its canon law is anchored in the law of the land, as it is for the Church of Scotland, but the Church of England's canon law gives Parliament rather a lot more control over the Church of England and its decisions than Parliament has over the Church of Scotland. Lucky you, is all I can say. The appeal was also really important for Anglican churches' relations to the Church of Sweden. I've already said that bishops were invited to be present at consecrations. By the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, there were agreements between Anglicans and the Church of Sweden, the Anglicans and the Church Finland, Anglicans and the churches of Latvia and Estonia, all emerging out of processes which rooted in the appeal. That led ultimately to the Porvo Agreement in 2001, which is between the Anglican churches, the British and Irish Anglican churches, I should say, and now almost all these Nordic and Scandinavian, Nordic and Baltic Lutheran churches, with the exception of the Church of Latvia. I can never, my fingers can't spell church, sorry about that. That should say Old Catholic Churches of the Union of Utrecht, which had emerged from the Roman Catholic Church in after the First Vatican Council. The Old Catholic Churches do not accept the infallibility of the Pope. They are in discussions with the Anglicans already by 1920. There's a mutual recognition of ministries in 1925, and in 1930 the Bonn Agreement comes about, again very much on the basis of the appeal. Now, what's interesting about the Bonn Agreement, and indeed about the relationships between the Anglican churches in Sweden and the Church of Sweden and Finland and Latvia and Estonia, is that these are churches' agreements which do not bring about an organic, a structural unity of the churches, but they do bring about mutual communion and mutual recognition of ministries. So I function when I'm not in Scotland, I'm in Germany because my husband's German, and I'm a member of the Old Catholic Church in Germany, and I function as a priest in the Old Catholic Church in Germany. So tomorrow I should be preaching in Scotland, in Glasgow, and in 2 weeks' time I should be preaching and celebrating the Eucharist in the Old Catholic Church in Munster. And I can do that as a priest on the basis of the Bonn Agreement in 1930. We have similar agreements between with the Porvo within the Porvo communion. If I spoke Swedish, which I don't, I could theoretically go and become a priest in the Church of Sweden. I think this raises a question about what do we believe unity is about. So the Church of Scotland and the Free Church and the United Free Church in 1929 came together to form a church. That's structural unity. Is that what we're aiming for? The bishops thought we were. In Lambeth in 1920, they were aiming for structural unity. The ecumenical movement increasingly seems to be saying, actually, we're not looking at structural unity, partly because of the legal issues. We're actually looking at trying to find agreements of communion. What is our vision? I think this raises some really interesting questions about what is our vision, and at what stage should we be satisfied that we've achieved unity. Now, George Bell, this is George Bell being rather rude about the Presbyterians, so I apologise for him. The view of the Presbyterians, he says, is that what is wanted is simply to get interchange of pulpits, and if it might be had into communion. If they had secured that, they would cease to desire or even perhaps to sanction anything further. Now, as I say, George Bell being rude here about the Presbyterians, it's very interesting reading the correspondence at Lambeth sometimes, because you get the unadulterated views of people which they would never put out publicly. So here's me putting it out publicly. But the question is exactly that. Are we now so comfortable with the level of unity and disunity? So we'll invite each other to preach, we'll go to each other's Eucharist. Have we actually allowed the scandal of disunity to be kind of sort of smoothed over by our mutual invitations to each other? And if we have, is that okay or is that not okay? I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but I think it is a really important question, and it's the vision of the appeal was something much more radical. So I do think there's a question about our current approaches that we're actually satisfied with a lot less than in 1920 they were hoping for. Discuss. You'll get a chance to discuss this in a minute. Williamson, who was the minister at Old St Charles in Edinburgh and who was at the General Assembly in 1922, because I think he was probably had just been moderator or was just about to become moderator, commented to the Archbishop, that in Scotland they had found that they'd made progress in the non-constitutional way, first of all, and now they were on the constitutional way. So the non-constitutional way of bringing back the United Free Church and the Church of Scotland together was things like, during the First World War, putting the seminary, putting the colleges together, so that ministerial candidates were being trained together in the two churches. So a lot of informal working together. I don't think there was much distinction between chaplains of the two churches, for instance. What Williamson here calls unconstitutional ways, and now they were seeking the constitutional way. How do we distinguish between those, and how would we get from the one to the other? The Lambeth vision is, within this unity, Christian communions, now separated from one another, would retain much that has long been distinctive in their methods of worship and service, because it's through a rich diversity of life and devotion that the unity of the whole fellowship will be fulfilled. I think the Lambeth bishops are offering a vision of unity and diversity, which used to be a real key phrase for Anglican ecumenists. It's what the Conference of Protestant Churches in Europe, the Leuenberg process, talks about in terms of reconciled diversity. And actually, in many ways, it's very closely related to what Roman Catholic theologians are now discovering as a new vision for ecumenical relationships, which I would want to argue is at least 100 years old, receptive ecumenism, where we share each other's gifts. We focus on what we have to offer one another, rather than focusing on what divides us. And I think that's very much what the vision that the bishops were coming from. So I'm going to hand over to you now to have some discussion about, does the vision of the appeal speak into our situation today? And if not, what kind of vision do we need? What is the vision of unity towards which we should be working? Should we be working towards structural unity? Should we be working towards something much looser? And what practical steps do you think actually need to be taken? You may want to choose on your table one of those questions to think about. You may have a totally different question. I don't want to be prescriptive here, but I think if you could spend, let's spend maybe 15 minutes having a discussion, and then we'll get some feedback from the tables and see what you've come up with.
I think that's a measure of the quality of the conversation that has been taking place around your tables, and doubtless there will be things that you wish to reflect with Charlotte about. So I open the floor, and John has a microphone.
Thank you, but it's still fine. I just want to thank you so much for this very, very enlightening presentation today. Actually, I'd not had this elaborate, about the appeal. So it's been very, very educative for me, and because I'm a student, so thank you. But I was just wanting to ask the question as to why did the organizers choose this particular document in talking about the issue of fragmentation with unity, in the concept of unity? I know that it came before 1948, WCC's formation, and of course it led to so many other ecumenical, discussions. Again, I may be very ignorant, but apart from the Bond agreement that was specifically directed at this, I don't know whichever other ecumenical formations or approaches or perspectives arose from this appeal, particularly because there's so many ambiguous issues in it. There's so many, forgive my use of the term, polemic issues in it. And there are also, forgive me again the use of the term, the idea that this document entitles the Anglican to dictate the pace of ecumenism.
Yeah.
And here we're talking about ecumenism as coming to the table as equals. Now, again, talking as an African, and I'm happy that Ajayi Crowther was there in 1920. But ecumenism with Anglicans in Africa is very problematic. And many times they use this document as what gives them the right to say, we were there before WCC and all of the peace talks, so we have the right to say how we want to have ecumenism and which ways and to what extent. So why this document and exactly how we're going to move forward in this document when there are newer documents on ecumenism to deal with the issue of fragmentation? Thank you.
I'm not sure I can answer that question because I'm here because John McPake invited me to come and speak about this. so you may need to ask John. I think there's something, I mean, for me as a historian, I am not presenting you this document to say this is how it should be, and I hope you haven't got that impression, because I think it has some inspirational aspects to it, and I think it has some aspects of it which are deeply rooted in its time and which are deeply problematic, and I'm sorry it gets used to beat people over the head with in Africa, because it shouldn't be that way. And I don't think this is about Anglicans claiming the right to dictate how ecumenism should be, though I'm aware that we do that sometimes. I think the interesting thing for me about this document, and why I bother spending time with it, is that it seems to me it's about the Anglican bishops saying this is not something we can do on our own. This is something that actually all churches need to come together to do. And it's very interesting reading the correspondence at the time about saying, well, actually, no, the Church of Scotland, the United Free Church, they need to finish that process. That's what's important. The Methodists need to work that process out. It's not about saying, well, actually, union with us is more important. And I guess as a historian, I just think historical documents are intrinsically interesting. But I don't think we should use them to say, these are not ideals. These are people grappling with questions in their own time. And sometimes looking at how people grapple with questions in their own time can help us reflect on, see differently. So we can see our own situations in a mirror sometimes. So I think and I guess it's just the anniversaries, We're in anniversary country at the moment.
I take full responsibility. For me, it is a key text in understanding the nature and development of ecumenism, especially within the English-speaking world. I think it is significant within a Scottish context, because the first thing that the reunited Church of Scotland did in the early 1930s was to begin to address the very questions raised by the Lambeth Appeal. And so the Church of Scotland, the Church of England, the Episcopal Church in Scotland, and the Presbyterian Church of England immediately began to reflect and produce several reports in relation to this. And many of the traditional stumbling blocks in terms of faith and order issues were fully addressed very early in that process. And there's a whole treasury which I believe offers continued inspiration for a renewal of the task. So I think the issues you raise are important ones, and I think the context for the Lambeth Appeal is the cessation of the so-called Great War, and that was within our society and in our time a cataclysmic event, the nature of which demanded a response, and part of that response is seen in the Lambeth Appeal, and so for that reason I take full responsibility.
Helen Hood from St Mary's Episcopal Cathedral in Edinburgh. You asked a question before these questions about have we allowed the scandal of disunity to disappear because we've become satisfied with how far we've got. And I suspect we have done that quite a lot. And it's actually when I've been with ecumenically minded Roman Catholics that they've reminded me of the pain of the disunity. I think it's still got quite a bit to say to us today. The Scottish Episcopal Church has recently reordained somebody who is a minister in the Church of Scotland for a particular circumstance, and yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has happened is that the place that it hurts has shifted. And so in 1920, lay people were experiencing the pain of not being able to communicate in each other's churches, which could mean that couples couldn't communicate together. Those of us who are married to Roman Catholics, which includes myself, still find ourselves in that situation in some context. On the whole, within pan-Protestantism, if we want to put it that way, that is no longer an issue in the same way. It immediately becomes an issue for those who are ordained who want to move churches. And that has been within the Leuenberg Agreement. The Community of Protestant Churches in Europe has helped to make those kind of transitions easier. But your example, we were discussing the same example on our table. I can testify that I was ordained deacon in a service at which somebody who had already been ordained by two different Lutheran churches was being ordained by an Anglican bishop as well. So those kind of things, proliferation of ordinations, still continues. And I think that's one of the reasons that actually these questions of faith and order continue to exercise us because of our church law, because of our canon law, because of our rules about the expectations of what is needed if somebody's to be ordained and who can serve where.
An interesting discussion that we had, and really I think the summary of it is that yes, we're comfortable with the 3 or 4 different churches on the high street, possibly on the same corner. But yet, people out with the church don't see it that way, because they see a disunited church. They don't want to be part of that. So, should we not have an expression of unity or a desire for unity for those who are outside in terms of mission, in terms of evangelism?
Yeah, I wish Susan was still here to speak to that, because I think that was what she was saying earlier as well, the perception from those who would not necessarily call themselves Christian, that disunity puts people off, I think is still important. And maybe we need to do a bit more listening to those who are not in, to hear what that looks like from outside.
Thank you. Mimi from Presbyterian Church in Taiwan. I hope you don't mind. I ask a really fundamental and a little bit silly questions. The definition of ecumenical. For me, there might be 3 layers of meaning of ecumenical. First is the different denomination in England or in Scotland or in UK. Second is the international faith group partners. The third should be a challenging for me, because the Christianity population in Taiwan is minority. So the third layer for me, ecumenical, should be reach out to the different religion people. I think I raise this question because I want to know if we need to redefine the meaning of ecumenical, because it will affect our vision and our action. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that's a really good example of how having terminology that distinguishes between what we would call ecumenical and interfaith it may actually not be very helpful. And I would also remind us that it's not all that long ago that people would say, well, I'm not sure it's even that long ago, maybe it's even now, people who are Protestant would say of Catholics they've got a different faith. You know? And actually interfaith, and one of the struggles we were having when we were I was on the Anglican Lutheran International Commission. We had the Lutheran co-chair came from Cameroon, and he said one of the problems that they had in Cameroon was that when the Catholics arrived, they chose one word for God in the local language, and when the Protestants arrived, the Lutherans arrived, they chose a different word for God. So again, they very much perception of interfaith, and I think you're quite right. We need to putting ecumenical discussions in the context of interfaith discussions can also actually really help us to remember what binds us and what unites us. You know, they always say there's nothing would make me more convinced that you're British than going abroad. and actually, you know, in chaplaincies, I've worked in chaplaincies in the diocese in Europe, as a Church of England's diocese in Europe for a long time, but you could say the same thing as the Synod, the European Synod of the Church of Scotland. You get people from all sorts of different British backgrounds, all sorts of different church backgrounds, put together in this one context and discovering their community. And how do we actually discover our community, and what is it? Takes us back to the question which came from over there. What's the enemy? Well, there's nothing like having a common enemy to actually discover what holds you together. I don't want to get back into this war metaphor, but I think we can get so focused on our differences that we forget what unites us. Thank you very much.
We wanted to look at the second question, the vision of unity towards which we should be working. And we were speaking about the challenge in that so many of our ecumenical instruments are set up to get the denominations to the table and to get them to talk to one another. A couple of things within that then emerge. One is that the differences are often not denominational but theological, and you will find extremes of theological view across the board within the denominations. And I remember when we visited the World Council of Churches, they were saying, you know, we're set up to deal with the denominational differences, not with the theological ones. My other question is that where we're seeing growth around the country is in the independent sector. So if there is unity, how do we actually come to the table with the proliferation of independent churches? Especially if we're coming from a denomination which would look at some of these independent churches and say, according to my ecclesiology, that is not a church. So how on earth do we get there? And I do have that question, if we're talking about people looking at the church and saying, I don't want to be part of it because it's divided. I'm actually not sure, because I'm not sure that denominationalism means very much to a younger generation. I don't see a younger generation really nailing their colours to the mast and saying, I'm a Presbyterian, or I'm an Anglican. Actually, I'm someone who is a person of faith. I'm maybe exploring faith, and I want to go where my friends go, and I'm not actually worried about what the tab is across the door. So in some senses, there's an openness and maybe an opportunity, but at the same time, I think a real challenge about how we get together and talk together.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure it's a question. I think much more of a comment, really, Marjorie. But a really helpful comment. I mean, I don't think it's just the younger generation. I was at university with people who are deeply committed Christians. Every time they've moved house, they've ended up with a different denomination because that was the place that they felt was articulating the gospel in the way that they were expecting to hear it. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but that was where they felt that they belonged. The question of how we relate to independent churches is one that I think everybody's struggling with. I think the Global Christian Forum offers a model of trying to bring people together to tell their Christian stories, which is not about being in a particular way of, it's not about bringing global communions together. It's not about expecting particular church structures. It's about saying, well, actually, we're trying to be followers of Christ. And it may be, I know that that's one of the models that's on the table for discussion at the moment. It's certainly a model that when I was in the Faith and Order Commission in England, we were looking at really closely because huge independent churches emerging in England as well. Yeah. Thank you very much.